a man who buried his heart with his dead wife, a woman who carried a secret heavier than the Montana snow, and a town that would rather watch them both burn than let them find peace. You think you know how a love story begins? Not this one. This one begins with a stranger standing in a dead woman's kitchen and a little girl who hadn't smiled in 2 years. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Caleb Mercer found a strange woman in his kitchen, he had already been awake for 4 hours. That was how his days worked now. Sleep came in broken pieces. 2 hours here, maybe 3 if exhaustion finally pinned him down. And then his eyes would open in the dark, staring at the ceiling above a bed that still felt too large no matter which side he slept on. He would lie there for a while, listening to the silence of the cabin, counting the sounds of the ranch the way other men counted prayers. The horse shifting in the barn, the wind pushing against the north wall, the creak of the floorboard outside Lucy's door that meant she was up and moving to the outhouse, which happened twice a night now because the child could not sleep either, and neither of them talked about it. He dressed in the dark. He always dressed in the dark. He had stopped lighting the bedside lamp months ago because the light made the room look inhabited in ways it no longer was, and that particular cruelty he did not need at 4 in the morning. By the time the sun cracked the edge of the Beartooth Range, Caleb had already mucked 2 stalls, replenished the water trough, and hauled 3 loads of split wood from the pile behind the barn to the covered stack near the cabin door. The temperature had dropped overnight, the kind of drop that felt deliberate, like the weather was trying to make a point. His breath came out in hard white clouds. The snow on the ground had crusted over with a thin shell of ice that crunched under his boots with each step, the sound sharp and clean in the frozen air. He paused outside the barn and looked at the cabin. It was a decent enough structure. His father had built the main section in 1871, and Caleb had added the back bedroom when he and Margaret got married. Then the storage lean-to 2 years after that when it became clear Montana winters were not interested in compromise. The cabin had good bones, thick log walls, a stone chimney that drew well even in wind, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and kept the mud off the threshold. But looking at it from the outside now, in the gray early light, it just looked tired. The window curtains were the same ones Margaret had sewn, and they were faded to near transparency. One of the porch steps had a crack in it that he kept meaning to fix. The paint on the door, the green that Margaret had picked out from the catalog and waited 6 weeks for the hardware store to stock, had gone dull and was starting to peel at the corners. He looked at it for a moment, then looked away and walked back toward the cabin. He was halfway up the porch steps when he smelled it. Bread. Not the ghost of bread, not the memory of it. Actual bread, warm and yeasty and real, coming from inside his house. Caleb stopped. He stood on the second porch step with one hand on the railing and tried to make sense of what his nose was telling him. Lucy could not bake bread. He had tried to teach her the summer before, and they had produced something that resembled bread the way a stone resembles a pillow. Roughly similar in shape, completely different in every quality that mattered. She was 8 years old. She could scramble eggs and warm up the leftover beans, and that was the extent of it. He reached for the door handle. Then he stopped again, because through the warped gap in the door frame he could hear something else. Humming. Low and quiet, and completely unself-conscious, the way a person hums when they think they're alone. A woman's voice, melody without words, drifting through the crack in the door like smoke. Caleb's first thought was that he was still asleep. His second thought was less charitable. His third thought arrived the same moment his hand closed around the Colt on his hip, and that thought was, someone is inside my house with my daughter. He opened the door and had the gun out before his boot crossed the threshold. The kitchen of the Mercer cabin was not a large room. It had a cast-iron stove against the south wall, a wooden table with 4 chairs that only 2 of them ever used, a dry sink, 2 shelves of mismatched dishes, and a window that looked east across the pasture toward the creek. Margaret had tried to make it cheerful. She had put a small vase on the table for wildflowers in summer and pine cones in winter, and she had painted the shelf boards a soft yellow that had seemed ridiculous to Caleb at the time, and that he had not been able to bring himself to repaint since. Standing at the stove, with her back to him and a dishcloth tucked into the waist of a dark wool skirt, was a woman he had never seen in his life. She was stirring something in the pot with one hand and had a loaf of bread. An actual golden brown loaf of bread on his actual cutting board, cooling beside the stove. She had dark hair pulled back into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, and she was not humming anymore because she had heard the door open and gone very still. The way animals go still when they sense something wrong. She turned around slowly, and she was not what he expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Younger, maybe. More frightened looking. She appeared to be in her mid-30s with a face that was handsome rather than pretty. Strong jaw, eyes the color of creek water in November. The particular kind of stillness in her expression that belongs to people who have learned, through hard experience, how to be calm when they are not. She looked at the gun in his hand and did not scream, which told him something. She looked at his face, then back at the gun, and said, in a voice so composed it was almost insulting, "I'm sorry. I knocked. No one answered." Caleb stared at her. "That's not how this works," he said. "No," she agreed. "I imagine it isn't." "Who are you?" "My name is Eleanor Vale." She kept her hands where he could see them. "My wagon broke down on the Billings Road about 1.5 miles east. The axle snapped. I've been walking since before sunup." "Walking from where?" "Billings, originally. I'm trying to reach the pass before it closes for the season. The pass closed 4 days ago." Something moved through her eyes, there and gone, like a bird crossing a window. "I didn't know that." "Where'd you come from before Billings?" "Oregon." "You're a long way from Oregon." "Yes," she said quietly. "I am." He kept the gun on her for another 5 seconds, then holstered it, which was not the same thing as trusting her. He was aware that he was still breathing too fast from the sprint up the porch steps, and that his heart was hammering the way it did in the seconds after you almost stepped on a rattlesnake. "There's a spare room at the Whitmore place," he said, 3 miles south. "That's where people in your situation usually go." "I tried there first. The woman who answered the door told me to go somewhere I won't repeat." Caleb knew Dora Whitmore, and that sounded exactly right. He was about to say something else, some form of no, some version of "I can hitch the wagon and take you to town myself," when he heard the soft shuffle of small feet on the floorboards behind him, and Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her brown hair tangled from sleep, her eyes blinking in the lamplight. She looked at the strange woman standing at the stove. Then, for the first time in what Caleb realized with a shock was at least a year, the corners of his daughter's mouth pulled up, not a full smile, just the beginning of one, like something waking up that had been asleep a long time. "You made bread," Lucy said. "I did." The woman's voice had changed, softer. "You must be Lucy. How do you know my name?" "There are drawings on the refrigerator with your name signed at the bottom." She nodded toward the shelf. "The one with the horse is very good." Lucy walked into the kitchen, fully awake now in the way children become fully awake when something interesting happens. She moved around the table and stood beside the woman and looked at the bread like it was something marvelous, which, in this house, Caleb supposed it was. He couldn't remember the last time the cabin had smelled like this. "Can I have some?" Lucy asked. The woman looked at Caleb. He looked at his daughter's face. "Not yet," he said, meaning not until I figure out what to do with you, but Lucy heard it as wait until it cools a little, which was probably better. So he didn't take her to town that morning. He told himself it was because the temperature was still dropping and the roads were icing over, and it would have been genuinely dangerous to hitch the wagon in those conditions. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth had something to do with the way Lucy had perched herself on the kitchen stool and was currently watching Eleanor Vale move around the cabin with the focused attention of a child encountering something rare and fragile. He sent Eleanor to wash up while he got Lucy dressed, and then he stood in the doorway of the main room and tried to think. The situation was not complicated on its face. A woman had broken down on the road and knocked on his door. He was a rancher with a spare room. The room in the back that had been a nursery and then had held some boxes and then had held nothing, just a small iron bed frame and a window that faced the mountain. He could let her stay until arrangements could be made, help her get her wagon hauled in and the axle repaired, and send her on her way whenever the pass reopened in spring. Spring was 3 to 4 months away. Right, he thought. That's the problem. A widowed man and a strange woman under the same roof for 3 or 4 months. He knew exactly what Harlan Briggs at the feed store would say. He knew what Pastor Donaldson would say. And Dora Whitmore, and every woman in the church quilting circle who had been looking at him sideways ever since he stopped attending services 14 months ago. He knew what the town would say. What he couldn't quite answer, standing in his own doorway, was why that mattered more than what was happening right now, which was Lucy talking, actually talking, not the one-word responses and dutiful nods he had gotten used to this stranger in his kitchen. He could hear his daughter's voice through the wall. "And this is where Papa keeps the good knives. But I'm not allowed to touch them, except the small one for apples, but only if he's watching." He pressed his fingers to his eyes and breathed. Eleanor Vale ate breakfast like a person who had not eaten well in some time. She was quiet about it, no embarrassing display, but Caleb noticed the way she worked through the eggs methodically, without wasting motion, the way people eat when they've learned not to take food for granted. He made coffee and set a cup in front of her without being asked. She looked up. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I need to know your situation." She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were rough, he noticed, not soft hands, working hands. "My situation is simple. My wagon is disabled. I have no way to complete my journey until the pass reopens. I need somewhere to stay." "And your husband?" Something in her face went quiet. "Not shut down?" She wasn't hiding anything, exactly. Just careful, the way you're careful handling something that still has edges. "He died." "When?" 14 months ago. He didn't ask how. People on the frontier died in all sorts of ways that didn't need to be cataloged at a breakfast table. "Children?" he asked. The careful look became something else briefly, a flicker of something raw and immediate that she pulled back almost instantly. "I had a son. He died as well." Caleb was quiet. Beside him, Lucy was pushing scrambled eggs around her plate, listening with the particular alertness of children who know they are witnessing something adult and important. "I'm sorry," he said. He meant it. He knew what that cost. He knew exactly what that specific kind of grief felt like, the weight of it, the particular way it sat in your chest even in good moments, the way it was always there, just waiting for a quiet moment to make itself known again. Eleanor nodded once. "Thank you." "Where were you headed? Before the pass?" "I have a sister in Bozeman. Or I had one last I heard. We've been out of contact." She paused. "I was hoping to reconnect." He studied her. She looked tired in the deep way. Not just from the road, but the other kind. The kind that sleep doesn't fix. He recognized it because he saw it every morning in his shaving mirror. 2 weeks, he heard himself say. Eleanor looked at him. "You can stay 2 weeks, while we figure out the wagon situation and whether there's some other route open." He said it as flatly as he could manage, like it was a business arrangement, which was what he needed it to be. "You'll have the back room. Meals are taken together. Any work you do around the house is your own business. I'm not asking for it, and I'm not asking you to stay idle either. Just don't cause problems in town." She studied his face for a moment with those gray-green eyes. "What kind of problems are you worried about?" "The kind where people talk." A brief dry something moved across her expression, not quite amusement, more like recognition. "I see. This is a small community. I understand. People make assumptions. Mr. Mercer." She set down her coffee cup. "I've been a widow for over a year. I've been on the road alone for 3 months. I'm not confused about the kind of assumptions people make." She paused. "I'll try to be invisible." Across the table, Lucy had stopped eating entirely and was watching both of them with her chin in her hand, completely riveted. Caleb looked at his daughter and saw something in her face he hadn't seen in a long time, a kind of eager, open attention that the ranch had failed to produce, that he himself had failed to produce, that this stranger had produced simply by showing up and baking bread in the dark. He pushed back from the table and stood up. 2 weeks, he said again. Like saying it twice made it less of a mistake. The back room had a problem, which was the boxes. He'd stacked them in there over the past 2 years. Boxes of Margaret's things that he couldn't bring himself to deal with but couldn't leave out either, because seeing them would destroy him, and not seeing them was apparently the only remaining option. Fabric, books, some of Lucy's old baby clothes that Margaret had carefully folded and saved. A carved wooden box with things in it that Caleb had not opened since the funeral and was not sure he would ever open again. He moved the boxes to the storage lean-to himself, carrying them in 2 trips through the brittle cold, stacking them along the back wall behind the feed sacks. He didn't look inside any of them. When he got back inside, Eleanor was showing Lucy how to knead bread dough, guiding the child's small hands with patient and unhurried instruction. Lucy's face was concentrated with effort, flour on her nose and her chin, the tip of her tongue visible at the corner of her mouth, the way it always appeared when she was working hard at something. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched for a moment before either of them noticed him. 3 days, he thought. I'll reassess in 3 days. He turned and went back outside to fix the fence section that had been leaning since October. She was not easy to read, Eleanor Vale. In the first week, Caleb found himself paying attention to her the way he paid attention to weather. Not because he wanted to, necessarily, but because she was a variable in his environment, and he was a man who had survived on this land by learning to read the variables correctly. She was useful, which he hadn't entirely expected. Not in an obvious, look-at-me way. She didn't bustle around trying to prove her worth, didn't make announcements about what she'd accomplished. She just did things, fixed things. The torn curtain in the main room was mended before he noticed it needed mending. The hinges on the storage shelf had been oiled, which stopped the squealing he'd been ignoring for 6 months. She reorganized the dry goods in a way that made them easier to access and replaced the shelf paper while she was at it. He noticed all of this and said nothing, because saying something felt like acknowledging more than he was prepared to acknowledge. She was careful about boundaries in a way he appreciated and found slightly unnerving. She knocked before entering rooms even when the door was open. She asked before using tools in the barn. She ate what was served without complaint or commentary. She retired to the back room in the evenings by 8 o'clock, and Caleb was privately grateful for this because it meant he could sit by the fire with his coffee and his silence without having to navigate the presence of another person. But sometimes he could hear her through the thin wall between the main room and the back bedroom. Not words. She kept her voice too low for that, but the quiet murmur of her talking to herself. Or maybe praying, or maybe just filling the silence the way solitary people sometimes do, which is to say, the way he did it himself sometimes, talking to Margaret in the dark, even knowing she couldn't answer. The town's reaction was faster than he'd hoped, and uglier than he'd prepared for. He'd known it was coming. He'd known the morning he drove Eleanor's broken wagon off the Billings Road and into his barn, where Ned Pryor from the neighboring spread had happened to be riding past, and had watched the whole operation with eyes that never stopped moving. By the end of that week, Harlan Briggs had made a comment about strays at the feed store that had been funny enough to get a laugh and pointed enough to be a threat. Pastor Donaldson had materialized on his porch one afternoon. Caleb hadn't been to services in over a year, but apparently the man could still find his way to the ranch, with an expression of ministerial concern that Caleb found less convincing than the man probably intended. "I heard you've got a woman staying with you," Donaldson said. He was a thin man with the kind of righteous energy that had nowhere to go now that the real frontier dangers had mostly been settled. He directed it at the moral condition of his congregation instead, which was less dangerous but considerably more irritating. "I heard that too," Caleb said. "Her situation concerns some members of the community. Her wagon broke down. Her situation concerns me." "Caleb," Donaldson put on the voice, the one that was supposed to suggest wisdom, and instead suggested that he had rehearsed this in front of a mirror. "A man in your position, what position is that?" A brief pause. "Widower. Raising a young girl alone. You have a reputation to maintain in this community. People look to you." Caleb looked at the pastor's horse, then back at the man. "I look to myself," he said. "Anything else?" Donaldson left with the particular injured dignity of a man whose interference has not been welcomed, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched him go and knew the conversation was not over. It was just moving to other porches. What he had not accounted for was Lucy. He'd been managing his daughter's grief, managing it the way you manage a slow leak in the barn roof, constantly aware of it and constantly improvising solutions that worked well enough to prevent complete collapse, but not well enough to actually fix anything. He read to her at night. He brought her to the barn to help with the horses, which she liked. He asked about her drawings. He made sure she ate, but he was not, and had never been, a naturally tender person. His own father had not been tender, and the frontier did not particularly reward tenderness anyway. He loved Lucy with a fierceness that would have alarmed him if he'd spent time looking at it directly, which he mostly did not. But love and comfort were two different things, and he knew the difference even if he couldn't reliably provide both. Eleanor apparently could. He didn't watch it too closely because watching it too closely did something uncomfortable in the region of his sternum. But he noticed the way Lucy had started leaving the backroom door open when she did her homework at the small table, positioned so she could see down the hall to the kitchen where Eleanor worked in the evenings. He noticed that Lucy had started setting the table with 3 plates without being asked. He noticed, and this one stopped him cold one morning because he hadn't heard it in so long, Lucy laughing. Not politely, not the small, careful laugh she used when he told her something he hoped was funny, and she was trying to make him feel successful. Actual laughter, the helpless kind, rising from the kitchen while Eleanor was apparently telling her something about a goat she'd once owned in Oregon that had developed opinions about laundry. He stood in the barn doorway and listened. He didn't go inside for a long time after. 11 days into Eleanor's 2-week stay, she found the photograph. He was out in the pasture mending fence when Lucy came running across the frozen field in her coat and mittens, slightly out of breath, and carrying something in her mittened hand. "Papa," she said, "the lady wants to know if she can move the photograph on the shelf. She says she doesn't want to touch it if it matters." Caleb looked at what Lucy was holding out. The small framed picture that had sat on the kitchen shelf since 1878, the one of him and Margaret taken the summer before their wedding. It had been in the same spot for so long he had stopped seeing it. "She found it?" he asked. "It was behind the curtain near the shelf. She was cleaning, and she moved it to the light to see it better, and then she saw who it was, and she—" Lucy paused. She looked sad. He took the photograph from his daughter. Margaret looked back at him. 22 years old, squinting slightly in the summer sun, a reluctant half-smile because she'd never liked having her picture taken. He had looked at this photograph 10,000 times. He was not sure he was looking at it right now, so much as looking through it. "Tell her it's fine where it is," he said. "She wanted to know where you'd want it." He thought about this for a moment. Then, "Put it on the mantel, the one in the main room." Lucy took the photograph back and ran toward the house. He turned back to the fence. After a moment, he drove the next staple into the post with 4 precise blows of the hammer. Then he set the hammer down on the fence rail and stood there in the cold and waited for whatever was happening in his chest to pass. It didn't pass quite. It just got manageable again. The blizzard came without much warning. He'd felt it coming. Ranchers learned to read the sky the way sailors read water, and the particular color of the clouds on the 3rd Friday of Eleanor's stay had told him something serious was building. He spent the afternoon securing the barn, double-latching the doors, bringing the horses in from the north pasture. He hauled extra wood onto the porch until the stack was shoulder-high. Eleanor helped without being asked, carrying armloads of wood with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, not complaining about the cold. Lucy helped carry smaller pieces and felt important about it. The storm hit at 9 that night. By morning, the cabin was an island. There was no going to town, no neighbors coming by, no escaping the fact that the 3 of them were sealed inside, with the wind hammering the north wall so hard that the window panes flexed and the stove had to be kept burning red all day just to hold the interior temperature at bearable. On the first day, they managed fine. He did repairs inside, fixed a loose leg on the kitchen table, rehung the cabinet door that had been catching since fall. Eleanor cooked, and the cabin smelled improbably good, a kind of warm sensory deception that made the howling outside seem like something happening to a different world. Lucy drew at the kitchen table and kept asking what they would do if they ran out of food, and Eleanor told her they had enough for 2 months easy, and Lucy said, "What about for a year?" And Eleanor said, "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." He was aware that he and Eleanor were carefully, deliberately avoiding spending long amounts of time in the same room, not rudely, not with any drama. Just the particular choreography of 2 adults who were conscious of each other's presence in a small space and were managing it through strategic movement. On the second day, this became harder. Lucy had gone to bed early with a headache, and the cold had deepened, and there was simply nowhere to go. He was at the table with the ranch ledger. Eleanor was in the chair by the fire with a book he recognized as one of Margaret's, a novel, cloth-bound, well-worn. "Is that yours?" he asked. She looked up. "I found it on the shelf. I should have asked. I'm sorry." "No, it's—" He paused. She read that one several times, the bindings probably held together by habit at this point. Eleanor turned the book over in her hands, considering it with a particular expression. She had good taste. She had strong opinions, he said, about books and most other things. He looked back at the ledger, then back up. She would have found a way to get my back up within 20 minutes of meeting her. The corner of Eleanor's mouth moved. The good ones always do. It was, he thought later, the first time he'd talked about Margaret to another adult since the funeral. Not performing grief, not answering the formal condolences of neighbors, actually talking the way you talk about a real person. He was not entirely sure what to do with that. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different silence than before, less armored somehow. He could hear the wind outside and the fire popping, and occasionally the sound of Eleanor turning a page. He didn't finish the ledger. He wasn't entirely sure when he stopped looking at it. How long were you married? Eleanor asked eventually, without looking up from the book. 9 years, he said. You? 7. She turned a page. Long enough to know what it feels like when it's gone. A pause. Not long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. He understood that exactly. He said so. She looked up then, and he saw something in her face he recognized. The slight, unguarded quality of a person saying a true thing out loud that they've only previously said inside their own head. The slight vulnerability of having been understood. I haven't talked about him in a long time, she said. My husband. I've been... She stopped. On the road, there's no one to talk to. You talk to the horses eventually, but they're limited conversationalists. What was he like? She considered the question seriously. Stubborn, she said. Not in a bad way. The good kind of stubborn, where you say you can't do something and he hears that as an interesting challenge. She looked at the fire. He built our house in Oregon himself, over 3 summers. He was not a natural carpenter, and the house showed it, but it stood. She paused. It was home. What happened? He said it quietly, meaning she didn't have to answer, but he was asking if she wanted to. She turned the book in her lap. Fire, she said. The wagon. I was ahead. I'd ridden forward to find the campsite while he drove. She stopped. By the time I got back, she stopped again. He didn't press. My son, she started, and then stopped so completely that the stoppage said more than the words would have. I know, Caleb said. She looked at him. I know, he said again. They sat there in the firelight with the blizzard outside. 2 people who had each lost the most important versions of their lives and were somehow still sitting upright in chairs. And that fact struck him as at once completely ordinary and profoundly strange. After a while, he put more wood on the fire. After a while longer, he said, I was in the barn. She waited. When it happened, I was in the barn. The midwife sent Lucy out to tell me to come, and I was in the barn because... He stopped. The reason seemed irrelevant now, and had seemed irrelevant for 3 years, but he'd told himself the story so many times it had worn grooves. By the time I got inside, it wasn't your fault, Eleanor said, not reflexively, the way people say it. Steadily, the way people say it when they mean it. I know that, he said, and then, I don't know that. I know it with the thinking part. The other part doesn't believe it. No, she nodded. The other part is louder in the dark. Yes. They looked at the fire. For what it's worth, Eleanor said after a while, she would have sent you to the barn anyway, to get you out of the way. Women do that. A small, dry note in her voice. We are considerate about it. It was such an unexpected thing to say that he found himself on the edge of a laugh. Not a full one, just the ghost of one, catching him off guard and leaving him slightly off balance. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. You have a daughter who laughs at my stories, Eleanor said quietly, who learned how to knead bread this week and was unreasonably proud about it, who drew a picture of the 3 of us yesterday on the kitchen table and didn't realize I saw it. She paused. Whatever you've been telling yourself about the kind of father you are, don't believe all of it. He sat with that. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of the cabin and the fire burned low and steady, and the night was long, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence had changed its quality. It had the texture of something that has been cleaned out. An empty room after all the old furniture has been moved, bare and a little vulnerable and strangely full of possibility. He sat in it and didn't move until the fire needed tending. Then he stood and added the wood and didn't look at her. But something was different. Something was different, and he had been alone long enough to know the precise shape of the thing, and it frightened him in the specific way that a man who has already lost everything is frightened by the possibility of wanting something again. He put the fireplace poker back in its stand. He said goodnight. He walked to his room and lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm and thought about nothing useful until, somewhere around 3 in the morning, he finally slept. The blizzard broke on the 4th day. It didn't end so much as exhaust itself. The wind dropping off in stages over the course of a gray afternoon, the snow thinning from a wall of white to scattered flurries to nothing, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. Caleb dug out the porch and the path to the barn while Eleanor made breakfast, and when he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, Lucy was sitting at the kitchen table teaching Eleanor the names of all the horses in order of who she liked best. "Ranger is first," Lucy was saying with the authority of someone who has thought about this extensively. "Then Belle because she's gentle, then Copper, then the 2 big ones Papa uses for hauling, but they don't really have personalities." "Every horse has a personality," Eleanor said. She was slicing bread and not looking up. "You just have to spend more time with them." "That's what Papa says too." "Your Papa is right." Caleb poured himself coffee and stood by the window and looked out at the white-berried ranch, and did not say that he found this particular coincidence of opinion mildly uncomfortable. He drank his coffee. He looked at the fence line. He was aware, without looking directly at it, of a domestic ease in the room behind him that had not been there 3 weeks ago, and he was not entirely certain what to do about that. 2 weeks had become 3, quietly, without either of them formally acknowledging it. The wagon axle had been assessed by Pete Granger from town, who came out on the 2nd day after the storm cleared and spent 20 minutes in the barn before announcing that the part would need to be ordered from Billings. Which could not happen, Pete noted unhelpfully, until the roads were passable enough for the supply wagon, which given current conditions would be at least another 3 weeks, maybe 4. He said this with the particular Montana indifference to other people's problems that Caleb had always found irritating until he'd developed it himself. Eleanor thanked Pete politely and gave him half a loaf of bread to take home, which Pete accepted with the expression of a man who had expected to deliver bad news and instead received something confusing. After he left, neither Caleb nor Eleanor mentioned the timeline. The 2 weeks had become an informal arrangement that neither of them was formally extending and neither of them was formally ending, which was its own kind of answer if he thought about it too directly. He chose not to think about it too directly. The ranch, meanwhile, was changing in ways he found difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. It wasn't that Eleanor was transforming the place into something unrecognizable. It was more that things were becoming recognizable again, returning to a version of themselves that had apparently been waiting underneath the 2 years of accumulated neglect and grief. The curtains Margaret had sewn were mended and hung straight now, letting in more light. The kitchen table had a clean cloth on it, which was not a fancy one, but was not the oil-stained canvas he'd been using since he stopped caring about such things. The shelf with the yellow painted boards had its dishes arranged by size, which was a small and stupid thing, and yet somehow made the kitchen feel like a room that someone intended, rather than a room that things had simply ended up in. He found himself noticing the changes at odd moments, coming in from the barn at dusk, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee in the morning. Small things. The way the cabin smelled different now, not just the bread, but wood smoke and whatever herbs Eleanor had hung near the stove, tied in bundles that looked slightly medicinal and slightly decorative and made the kitchen look like a place where someone actually lived. He noticed it and did not remark on it because he was not sure how to remark on it without acknowledging too much. What he couldn't ignore, and eventually stopped trying to ignore, was Lucy. His daughter was not a different child. She was the same child, with the same streak of stubbornness that had been driving him to distraction since she learned to talk, the same way she got quietly furious when she thought she was being treated younger than she was, the same tendency to go completely silent when she was upset rather than crying, which was the thing that frightened him most because it meant he couldn't always tell. She was not different. She was more herself, which was something he hadn't known to miss until it started coming back. She'd started laughing again. The real kind, not the managed kind. She talked at the dinner table about things that happen at school, about the drawings she was working on, about complicated interpersonal dramas among the 8-year-olds of Millhaven that Caleb understood approximately 30% of but listened to with full attention because the act of her talking felt like something precious that could be frightened off by inattention. She had resumed reading. She'd stopped for a while after Margaret died, and he'd noticed and hadn't known how to fix it, and now she was working through the same novel shelf that Margaret had kept, picking up books and asking Eleanor what they were about. He watched Eleanor with his daughter the way he watched the spring ice on the creek. Carefully, from a slight distance, aware that something was happening under the surface that he couldn't entirely see. Eleanor was patient in the way of someone who has thought about patience as a practice rather than a natural trait. She made space for Lucy's silences without rushing to fill them. She answered questions directly, without the condescending simplification that Lucy had always rightly despised. When Lucy got something wrong, the bread, the mending, the arithmetic she was supposed to be practicing, Eleanor corrected it matter-of-factly, without the excessive reassurance that Lucy had also always, rightly, despised. She treated the child like a person with a working mind, which was the one thing Caleb had come to understand that Lucy needed most. He should have been relieved. It was good for his daughter. It was exactly what Lucy needed, and he was glad of it. He was glad of it, and he was also, underneath that, quietly terrified, in the particular way of a man who has learned, through expensive experience, that things he depends on have a habit of disappearing. The town's reaction arrived the way bad weather arrives. First, a few isolated signs that most people ignore, then an escalating series of events that make the earlier signs look like they were clearly pointing toward something obvious all along. Harlan Briggs's comment at the feed store had been the first sign. Caleb had classified it as Harlan being Harlan, which was a reasonable classification since Harlan had been practicing strategic small cruelties for decades and had no apparent intention of stopping. Pastor Donaldson's visit had been the second sign, which Caleb had also mostly ignored, telling himself that a man who showed up uninvited to offer moral guidance to a neighbor had the structural weakness of any argument that nobody asked for. The third sign was harder to ignore because it involved Lucy. She came home from school on a Thursday in the third week of Eleanor's stay. She walked the 1.5 miles each way, which Caleb had mixed feelings about, but which Lucy had insisted on with sufficient force that he'd yielded. And she came in through the front door and set her school bag down with the particular controlled carefulness that meant she was holding something difficult and was managing it very deliberately. "How was school?" Eleanor asked from the kitchen. A pause. "Fine." Caleb looked up from the harness he was repairing at the table. Lucy was hanging up her coat with her back to both of them, taking longer than necessary. "Luce," he said. "Sarah Briggs says you're a fallen woman," Lucy said to the coat hook. Her voice was steady and flat and 8 years old and furious. The kitchen went quiet. Eleanor turned from the stove. "She says her mama says you came here on purpose and that you're—" Lucy stopped, turned around, looked at Eleanor with an expression Caleb recognized as the one she used when she was fighting very hard not to cry. "She said some things I don't think are true, but she said them in front of everyone." Eleanor looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. Something passed between them, acknowledgement of a situation that had moved from annoying to actively affecting his daughter, which changed its category completely. Eleanor crossed to Lucy and crouched down to her level, which put them eye to eye. "What did you say back?" she asked. "Nothing," Lucy said. "Sarah's bigger than me." "That's fine. Sometimes the right answer is nothing." Eleanor kept her voice level. "Lucy, look at me." Lucy looked. "You know what I am and what I'm not, because you've been here for 3 weeks. What other people think they know from across town doesn't change what you know from inside this house. Understood?" Lucy looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay," Eleanor said, and stood up and went back to the stove. Later that night, when Lucy was in bed and Caleb was sitting at the table with the ranch ledger he was increasingly failing to focus on, he said, without looking up, "It's going to get worse." "I know," Eleanor said. She was darning a sock. She did not look up either. "Briggs talks to Whitmore. Whitmore talks to the church committee. The church committee makes official problems," Eleanor said. "I've seen it before." She bit off a thread. "I'm sorry about Lucy." "It's not your fault." "I know it isn't." She turned the sock over. That doesn't mean I'm not sorry it happened. He looked at her hands on the darning, the efficient, practiced movement, the slight calluses at the base of her fingers. He looked back at the ledger. Where did you live? He asked. In Oregon. What was it like? She seemed slightly surprised by the question, which he understood, since he had not been particularly forthcoming with personal conversation before the blizzard and had been somewhat cautiously managing their interactions since. But the blizzard had rearranged something, cracked something open between them that he was not sure could be fully closed again, and the question had come out before he decided to ask it. Valley land, she said, near the Willamette. We had 40 acres, nothing like this. Smaller. But we had an apple orchard and a good kitchen garden and a creek that ran cold even in August. She was quiet for a moment. It was a good life for a while. Do you miss it? She was quiet for long enough that he looked up. She was looking at the fire with the particular expression he'd come to recognize as her honest face, the one without any management in it. I miss the idea of it, she said finally. The version of it that existed before everything fell apart. The actual place, I don't know. It wasn't the same after. She paused. Places are strange that way. You can live somewhere that was good and then come back to it after loss, and it's all still there, but none of it is the same because what made it feel like home was the people in it, not the land. He thought about that. He thought about the way this cabin had felt since Margaret died. All the same walls, the same floor, the same shelf with the yellow paint, and yet consistently, persistently wrong, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. I know that, he said. She looked at him. He looked at the ledger. I know you do, she said. The following week, Ruth Calloway stopped him outside the post office. Ruth Calloway was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had organized the quilting circle, coordinated the town's winter food drive, and generally operated as the community's unofficial social administrator, which meant she had opinions about propriety that she experienced as civic duty rather than personal interference. She was 61 years old and had the expression of a woman who has been right about most things for long enough that being right had become load-bearing. Caleb? She put herself in his path with the practiced ease of a woman who had been stopping people from things for decades. I'm going to speak plainly. I'd prefer that, he said, which was true. The situation at your ranch. People are concerned. Which people? Many people. Good people who care about what kind of community we're building here. She said it with the gravity of someone describing infrastructure. You have a daughter, Caleb. You have a standing in this town that your father built and that people respect. You have a... She paused, recalibrating. You have a situation that is causing talk. I have a woman who needed shelter, he said. Her wagon broke down. The pass is closed. That may be true, but the longer she stays, Caleb said, is between me and my ranch. Ruth's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. We're only trying to help. Help would have been someone in this town offering her a room 3 weeks ago instead of sending her down the road. He heard the edge in his own voice and modulated it slightly, because Ruth was not his actual enemy here, and he knew it. I appreciate the concern. The situation is under control. He walked past her. He made it half a block before he heard her say, behind him, the committee meets on Friday. He kept walking. He didn't tell Eleanor about the committee meeting. He told himself this was because he didn't want her to worry, and that it probably amounted to nothing. The committee meeting would produce some strongly worded expressions of concern that would be conveyed to him in another doorstep conversation, and he would decline them with similar firmness, and eventually the town would find something more interesting to disapprove of. He told himself this, and mostly believed it until the following Monday, when Harold Briggs and Tom Eckerd and Pastor Donaldson arrived at the ranch together, which was the kind of configuration that did not mean a social visit. Caleb met them at the porch steps. He did not invite them in. This was deliberate. Donaldson did the talking, which was appropriate since he was the one with the vocabulary for these situations. Caleb stood with his arms crossed and his weight balanced and his face neutral, while Donaldson explained with all the careful regret of a man who has convinced himself he's doing someone a favor that the town committee had met and had determined that the presence of an unattached woman in Caleb's household, a woman of unknown character and unclear background, was injurious to community standards. and that furthermore, given the vulnerability of a young girl being raised in the household, the committee had an obligation to consider what arrangements were in the child's best interest. Caleb let him finish, then he said, "Are you threatening to take my daughter?" Donaldson's face moved through several configurations. "It's not a threat, it's a concern. I heard what you said. The girl needs a stable." "The girl?" Caleb said, with a flatness that he was aware could be mistaken for calm and was not, "is in the kitchen learning long division. She is healthy and fed and has laughed every day this week. I know this because I've been watching." He looked at all three of them. "You want to explain to me what's wrong with that?" Eckerd, who had always been the least convinced of the three, looked at his boots. Briggs looked at the barn. Donaldson looked at Caleb with the unshakable expression of a man who has organized his certainty around something that is not quite right but is too load-bearing to examine. "We're asking you to make a choice," Donaldson said, "for the sake of the community and for the sake of your daughter." "I'll make a choice," Caleb said, "when I'm ready to make one." They left. He stood on the porch and watched them ride back down the track toward town, and felt something in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was probably some unpleasant combination of both. The afternoon was cold and still, and the mountains were turning pink with the late sun, and the ranch was exactly as it had been an hour ago. And he was aware, standing there, that the thing he had been avoiding thinking about directly now had a deadline attached to it. He heard the screen door behind him and knew it was Eleanor without turning around, because her step was a little lighter and a little more hesitant than Lucy's. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. A pause. "Enough." He looked at the mountains. "I can write to my sister," Eleanor said. "I don't know if she'll answer, but I can try to arrange something, find somewhere else to—" "That's not what I said." "Caleb." He heard her come to stand beside him. She kept a careful distance. "I don't want to be the cause of you losing your daughter. If they're serious about petitioning—" "They're not serious," he said, which was something he mostly believed. "They're performing. It's what they do." "And if they're not performing?" He didn't answer that. They stood there while the sun finished dropping behind the range, and the cold deepened and the first stars appeared in the east, faint and distant and unreachable. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." He turned and looked at her. The last light was going and her face was half in shadow, and she was looking at him with that same honest expression, the one without any management in it, and he was standing in front of her with the full knowledge of what he was about to lose if he made the wrong choice, and what he might lose if he made no choice at all. "You changed this house," he said. He said it as flatly as he could manage, because the flat delivery was the only way he knew to say things that had weight without them coming out wrong. "Since you've been here. I don't mean the curtains, I mean—" He stopped, started again. "My daughter is alive in a way she wasn't before you came. I don't know what I was, less alive than I should be. You changed it." Eleanor was quiet. "I'm not saying that to put something on you," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that whatever I decide, whatever we decide, it has nothing to do with those men and what they said on my porch. You understand?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I understand," she said. Neither of them said anything else. After a while, Eleanor went inside to start dinner, and the warmth and light from the kitchen spilled out onto the porch boards and disappeared into the cold dark of the Montana evening. Caleb stood there a little longer before following her in. Inside, Lucy was setting the table with 3 plates without being asked. The days after Donaldson's visit settled into a strange, suspended quality, like the air before a second storm, outwardly calm, inwardly charged with something that hadn't discharged yet. Caleb went about his work. He fed the horses, checked the fence line, hauled wood, did the 1,000 small tasks that a working ranch demanded regardless of what was happening inside the house or what 3 men on horses had said on his porch. Eleanor cooked and cleaned and helped Lucy with her schoolwork in the evenings. The 3 of them ate dinner together and talked about ordinary things: the horses, the weather, what Lucy was reading, whether the creek would flood in spring the way it had the year before. From the outside, if anyone had been watching, it would have looked unremarkable. From the inside, Caleb was aware of a constant low-grade tension that he couldn't entirely locate. It wasn't between him and Eleanor. If anything, the porch conversation had made things easier between them, in the way that naming a thing sometimes does. It was more internal than that, a pressure behind his sternum that he recognized, from experience, as the feeling of a decision building toward a point where it could no longer be deferred. He did not act on it. He was, at his core, a man who preferred to let situations develop until their shape was unmistakable before he moved. Margaret had found this quality maddening. She had called it deliberate stubbornness dressed up as caution. She had been, he reflected now, almost entirely correct. What broke the suspended quality was not another visit from Donaldson or another report of town gossip. It was Lucy. It started on a Wednesday evening, a cough that seemed like nothing, the dry kind that comes from cold air and too much time outdoors. Eleanor mentioned at dinner that Lucy had coughed twice during their reading session. Caleb noted it and said she'd probably picked something up from one of the other children at school. Lucy herself dismissed it with the authority of a child who does not want to be treated as sick. By Thursday morning, the cough was deeper. By Thursday evening, it wasn't just a cough. Lucy came to dinner with a color in her face that had nothing to do with the cold, the high, bright flush that Caleb recognized immediately and felt in his own bloodstream like a drop in temperature. Her eyes had the glassy, slightly unfocused quality that meant a fever had already established itself and was working. She sat down at the table and tried to eat and managed 3 bites before putting down her fork. "I'm not hungry," she said, which was how Caleb knew she was genuinely ill, because Lucy was constitutionally incapable of voluntarily stopping eating under normal circumstances. Eleanor was already across the room, the back of her hand against Lucy's forehead, before Caleb had fully processed what he was seeing. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it sharpened and became focused in a way he'd not seen before. "How long have you felt this way?" Eleanor asked. "Since school," Lucy said. "Maybe before." "Does your head hurt?" "Some." "Your throat?" Lucy swallowed experimentally and winced. "A little." Eleanor looked at Caleb. The look lasted about 1 second and contained approximately a paragraph of information, none of it good. He got Lucy into bed while Eleanor heated water. He sat on the edge of the mattress and felt his daughter's forehead himself. Hot, genuinely hot, the kind of fever that had weight to it, and tried to keep his face neutral while his mind was doing something he did not appreciate, which was running through every bad outcome he'd ever heard of in 18 years on the Montana frontier. "Am I dying?" Lucy asked. "No," he said. "You look like I might be." "I always look like this." Lucy considered this. "That's true," she conceded, with the brutal honesty of sick children. Then she coughed again, deep and rattling, and he put his hand on her back and felt the fever working through her like a fire in a wall. Eleanor appeared in the doorway with a basin and a cloth and a cup of something that steamed with an herbal smell. She moved past Caleb with a quick, precise energy that was different from her usual unhurried manner. Not panicked, nothing close to panicked, but accelerated, switched into a different mode of operation. "I need you to go to the barn," she said. "I'm staying with her. I need dried chamomile from the second shelf, the bunch tied with red string, and the small brown bottle that's wrapped in cloth. It's in my travel bag under the bed. I moved some things out there when I reorganized." She was already wringing the cloth and folding it. "Caleb," she looked at him directly. "Go. I've done this before. I know what I'm doing." He hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, which was 1.5 seconds longer than she needed him to hesitate based on her expression. Then he went. He found the chamomile and the bottle and came back to find Eleanor sitting on the edge of Lucy's bed with the child's hand between both of hers, talking quietly. Not about the fever, not about medicine, just talking, some story about Oregon, her voice low and steady and deliberate, giving Lucy something to follow that wasn't the discomfort of her own body. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he gave Eleanor the chamomile and the bottle and went to build up the fire. The first night was bad. The fever climbed through the evening and peaked somewhere around midnight, reaching the kind of temperature that made Caleb's hands unsteady when he changed the cool cloths. He was not a man who came undone easily. The frontier had cured him of that particular luxury years ago, but he sat by his daughter's bed in the small hours of the morning and felt the specific helplessness of a parent watching a child suffer with no reliable mechanism to stop it, and it was the worst feeling he knew. Eleanor did not sleep. She came in and out of Lucy's room throughout the night with cloths and medicines and cups of the herbal brew she'd put together, coaxing Lucy to take small sips when the child was awake enough to manage it. She replaced the cloths with a mechanical regularity that spoke of someone who had learned fever care through practice rather than instruction. She checked Lucy's breathing every hour. She noted each change in the fever's pattern with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who knew what warning signs to watch for. Around 3 in the morning, Caleb sat in the chair beside the bed and put his face in his hands. He heard Eleanor come in, heard her set something down on the nightstand. "She's not worse than an hour ago," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. "The fever's holding where it is. That's not good, but it's not bad. She's 8 years old." "I know. I can't—" He stopped, pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I've already done this once. I can't do it again." A silence. Then Eleanor sat down on the edge of Lucy's bed, carefully, so as not to disturb the child, and said, "Listen to me. Lucy is strong. Her breathing is clear. The fever hasn't gone higher in 2 hours. These are all things that matter." A pause. "I need you to stay with me, not fall apart. Can you do that?" He looked up. She was watching him with an expression that was neither soft nor hard, something in between, something that acknowledged the fear without feeding it. "Yes," he said. "Good." She turned back to Lucy and adjusted the cloth. "Then stay." He stayed. The second night was worse in a different way. The fever broke briefly in the late afternoon of the first day, and Lucy was conscious and alert for 3 hours, long enough to drink some broth and ask Eleanor to tell her the rest of the Oregon goat story, which Eleanor did in its entirety, including the part where the goat had somehow gotten onto the roof of the summer kitchen and refused to come down for 6 hours. Lucy laughed, weakly but genuinely, and then fell into what seemed like real sleep, and Caleb sat in the kitchen and let himself feel the relief of it, which was enormous and immediate and short-lived. The fever came back at midnight, higher this time. Eleanor woke him from the doze he'd fallen into at the kitchen table, her hand on his shoulder, her voice contained but urgent. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, following her down the hall to where Lucy lay with her hair damp against the pillow, and her breathing audible in a way breathing shouldn't be. "What do we need?" he said. "More water, as hot as you can get it, and I need—" She was already at her bag, pulling out bundles of dried plants with a concentration that excluded everything else. "There's a root in the small pouch. Looks like dried ginger, but it isn't. Bring it." He didn't ask questions. He built up the fire and heated water and brought her everything she asked for and stood back and watched her work. And what he watched was not what he'd expected to watch. Eleanor Vale at 3 in the morning, in a sick child's room, with no doctor available and no road passable, and nothing between Lucy and whatever the fever intended except her own knowledge and hands. She was not gentle and tender in the way people describe women in such situations. She was focused, methodical, slightly fierce. She spoke to Lucy when the child surfaced into consciousness, not soothingly exactly, but firmly, in the voice of someone who has decided that this outcome is not acceptable and is making that decision known to all parties, including the fever. "Stay with me, Lucy. I know it's bad. It's going to be less bad. Drink this." "It tastes awful," Lucy managed. "Yes, it does." "Drink it anyway." Lucy drank it. At some point during the second night, Caleb stopped cataloging Eleanor's movements and simply watched her, without trying to process or classify what he was observing. He sat in the chair in the corner of the room and watched a woman he'd known for less than 2 months fight for his daughter's life with nothing but knowledge and stubbornness and the refusal to consider the alternative. And he felt something shift in his chest that was not like the careful, guarded acknowledgments he'd been permitting himself. It was larger than that, less manageable. He didn't name it, he wasn't ready to name it, but he felt it clearly and unmistakably, and later, days later, when Lucy was eating at the table again and the crisis had retreated into something he could look at from a distance, he would remember this as the moment when something changed that he could not pretend hadn't changed. The third day was the pivot. Lucy woke mid-morning with the fever lower and her eyes less glassy and asked for eggs. Caleb made eggs, and a week's worth of relief compressed itself into the 3 minutes it took her to finish them. Eleanor sat across the table and drank her coffee and watched Lucy eat with an expression he recognized now as her relief face, quiet, contained, slightly exhausted, like a person who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. "You're going to be tired for a few days," Eleanor told Lucy. Don't fight it. Sleep when you're tired. I hate sleeping during the day, Lucy said, with the returning energy of someone who has been sick enough to understand what feeling better means. I know. Do it anyway. You sound like Papa. Eleanor glanced at Caleb over the top of her coffee cup. He looked back. Something passed between them that was too complicated to name and too real to pretend wasn't happening. I'll take that as a compliment, Eleanor said, and drank her coffee. He came to find her that evening. She was on the porch. She'd taken to coming out here in the half hour after Lucy went to bed. He'd noticed this weeks ago, her quiet need for 10 minutes outside, where the ceiling was the sky and there was no wall within arm's reach. He had deliberately not appeared during these 10 minutes because he understood the need without having to have it explained. Tonight he came out anyway, because what had happened over the past 3 days had rearranged things again. And the thing that had shifted in his chest during those long night hours was still there, and it was getting heavier rather than lighter. She heard him come out and move slightly to make room at the porch railing, which was something, the unconscious accommodation of someone who has gotten used to sharing a space. They stood together in silence for a moment. The night was clear and cold, the stars very bright and very far away. The mountains were black silhouettes against a slightly lighter sky. "How are you?" he said. She looked at him. It was the kind of look that says that's an unexpected question. "Tired," she said. "Fine." A pause. "Better now that she's eating." "You didn't sleep for 3 days." "I slept some." "I was here." "You didn't sleep." She turned back to the mountains. "I've done this before," she said. "Not here. In Oregon. One of the neighbor's children had fever the second winter we were there, and there was no doctor and her mother was alone. I stayed." She stopped. "The child recovered." "And your son?" He said it quietly, aware that it was the sharpest question he'd asked her, and that she might not answer it, and she went still beside him in the way she went still when something had hit a live wire. "Thomas?" she said after a moment. "His name was Thomas." Another pause. "He was 4 years old. He got sick on the trail, and I did everything." Her voice had a fracture in it, fine as a hairline crack, controlled. "I did everything I knew how to do, and I knew quite a lot. And it wasn't enough." She stopped. "He died on a Tuesday morning, and the sky was completely clear, and I have hated clear skies ever since." Caleb didn't say he was sorry. He had said it before, and she didn't need it said again. He stood beside her and let her have the silence for a moment. "That's why you didn't stop," he said. "With Lucy, the 3 nights." She looked at him. "Because you were not going to let it happen again," he said. "Not to another child. Not if you could stop it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face went very still in a different way than usual. Not the controlled stillness, not the careful management, but the kind of stillness that happens when a person is seen accurately and doesn't know what to do with it. "Something like that," she said. He nodded. They stood at the railing in the cold dark, close enough that he could hear her breathing. The ranch was quiet. The horses settled, the wind down, the creek a distant murmur in the darkness below the pasture. The same sounds he'd been hearing for years. They sounded different tonight, or maybe he was just hearing them differently. Standing here next to another person who was still alive and present and had spent 3 nights refusing to let his daughter go. "Eleanor." He said her name and stopped. She waited. He'd had some idea of what he wanted to say. Standing in the kitchen 20 minutes ago, he'd thought he knew the shape of it. Standing here, it came out differently than he'd planned, which was probably more honest. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have no idea how to do this, any of this." He stopped. "What happened in that room, the last 3 nights? What you did for her?" He stopped again. "I don't know how to say what that means to me without making it sound like I'm talking about gratitude, which is not, it's not only that." She had turned to look at him. The moonlight was enough to see her face, and her face was doing the honest thing again. No management, just Eleanor Vale standing at his porch railing after 3 sleepless nights looking at him with the gray-green eyes and waiting. "I know that's not a complete sentence," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I'm working on it." Something moved through her expression. Not amusement exactly, but something in that direction. Warm and sad and complicated, the way things are when they're real. "Take your time," she said. He looked at her, The cold pressed in from all sides, and the mountains stood black against the sky. And somewhere in the cabin, his daughter was sleeping with a normal temperature, and the porch boards were solid under his feet, and he was standing in the middle of his own life, looking at a woman who had walked in out of a blizzard, and gradually, without particular announcement, changed what his life felt like from the inside. He didn't say anything else that night. He wasn't ready, and she knew he wasn't ready, and she didn't push, which was one of the things, he was aware enough to know this, that he valued about her. But he didn't go back inside either. They stood there at the railing together for another 20 minutes, not talking, just present in the same dark and the same cold, until the temperature dropped enough that she shivered once, and he noticed, and they both went inside without a word. He lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling above the bed that still felt too large. But it felt slightly less large than it had 3 weeks ago. He noticed this, and noted it, and did not quite know what to do with it except let it be true. 2 days later, Lucy was back at the kitchen table doing her schoolwork and requesting more bread with the appetitive urgency of a child making up for lost time. Eleanor obliged. The cabin smelled of bread and the fire was burning well, and it was mid-afternoon with flat winter light coming through the mended curtains, and everything in the room looked ordinary. On the road to town, invisible from the ranch window, a rider Caleb didn't see was heading toward the Briggs property with news about the committee and what they'd decided to do next. He didn't know about that yet. What he knew was that Lucy was eating and Eleanor was here, and outside the snow was beginning to thin at the edges where the south-facing slopes caught the afternoon sun. Not enough to matter, not yet, but enough to notice. He noticed it. He didn't let himself read too much into it, but he noticed. The committee's decision arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a letter. Not delivered by post, say, delivered by hand, which was its own kind of statement. Tom Eckerd rode out to the ranch himself, which told Caleb that whoever had drafted the letter wanted him to have no question about whether he'd received it. Eckerd didn't dismount. He leaned down from the saddle and held out the envelope with the expression of a man who had drawn a short straw and knew it. "Committee asked me to bring this out," Eckerd said. Caleb took it. He looked at the envelope. The Millhaven Community Welfare Committee seal pressed into the wax, Donaldson's handwriting on the front, formal and careful as a verdict. "You read it?" Caleb asked. Eckerd shifted in the saddle. "I know what it says." "Then tell me." A pause. Eckerd was not a bad man. Caleb had always known this, the same way he knew Briggs was not a good one, and Donaldson was somewhere complicated in the middle. Eckerd had 3 kids of his own and a wife who made preserves and brought them to sick neighbors, and didn't have an opinion about much except that people should generally be left alone. He'd been on the committee for 2 years because someone had to be. "They want the woman gone," Eckerd said, "within a week. If she's still here after that, they're filing a formal petition with the county administrator, citing moral welfare of a minor child." He paused. "I voted against it." "I know you did," Caleb said. Eckerd looked at him for a moment. Something in his face, regret maybe, or the particular discomfort of a man caught between what he thinks is right and what the room he's sitting in decides. "I'm sorry, Caleb." He rode back down the track. Caleb stood with the envelope and didn't open it, because Eckerd had told him everything it contained, and reading it would only make it more formal, more real, more the kind of thing that required an official response rather than an honest one. He put it in his coat pocket and went to finish the morning work. He didn't tell Eleanor right away. He wasn't sure why. Some combination of not wanting to see her face when she found out, and needing time to figure out what he was going to do about it before the situation became a conversation. The ranch work absorbed him for most of the morning. He mucked stalls and checked the water troughs and repaired the section of fence near the creek that had been listing since the last hard freeze, doing the work with the mechanical competence of a man who has done it 10,000 times and doesn't need to think about it, which left his mind free to do something he didn't want it doing, which was think. The problem, laid out plainly, was this. The committee had the standing to file the petition. Whether a county administrator would act on it was less certain, but the filing itself would be enough to damage him. It would go on record. It would mean lawyers and hearings and the kind of sustained official attention that disrupted a ranch the way nothing else could. And at the end of all of it, at the end of a process that could take months and cost him in ways he couldn't fully calculate, there was a version of events in which a county official looked at a widower with a woman of uncertain background living in his house and made a decision that had nothing to do with what was actually happening inside that house. He knew this. He had known it, in some form, since the first week. The difference was that it had been theoretical, and now it had a wax seal and a deadline. He was at the fence line, replacing a rotten post, when he became aware of being watched. He turned and found Lucy sitting on the top rail of the adjacent section, 20 feet away, her coat buttoned to the throat and her boots dangling. She had the look of a child who has been there long enough to have observed something, but not long enough to have been noticed. "How long have you been sitting there?" he said. "A while." She picked at the fence rail with her mittened fingers. "Mr. Eckerd came this morning." "I know. I was there." "What did he want?" Caleb set the post driver down and looked at his daughter. She was watching him with the direct measuring quality she'd had since she was small. The one that was all Margaret, the one that meant she'd already formed a hypothesis and was checking it against his face. "Committee business," he said. "About Eleanor, not a question." He studied her face for a moment. The 8-year-old face with its frank eyes and its slightly too knowing expression, the face of a child who had been living alongside adult grief and adult silence for 2 years and had developed, out of necessity, a finely calibrated ability to read what the adults around her weren't saying. "Yes," he said. Lucy was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then, "Are they going to make her leave?" "They want to." "What do you want?" He picked up the post driver. "I'm working on it." "Papa?" Her voice had a firmness in it that was also all Margaret. "What do you want?" He drove the post into the frozen ground with 3 hard strokes, and the impact traveled up through his arms and into his shoulders, and he stood there with the post driver in his hand and the cold pressing in and his daughter watching him from the fence rail. "That's a complicated question," he said. "I'm 8, Lucy said. "Not 4. He set the post driver down again and turned to look at her properly. "I know," he said. He drove home in the late afternoon with the letter still in his coat pocket, and the decision still not entirely made, which was not quite accurate. The decision was made, had probably been made somewhere around the 3rd night of Lucy's fever, sitting in the corner of his daughter's room, watching Eleanor work. But the courage to act on it was a separate thing from the decision itself, and he was still working on assembling the courage. The cabin was warm when he came in. Dinner was on the stove. Eleanor was at the table helping Lucy with an arithmetic problem, pointing at something in the workbook with a pencil, and Lucy was arguing with the pencil's conclusion, and it was so ordinary and so specifically, precisely what the ranch had not been for 2 years, that he stood in the doorway longer than he needed to before either of them noticed him. Eleanor looked up, saw his face. She saw his face the way she always saw his face, carefully reading it. And then she looked back down at the workbook and said to Lucy, "Try it the other way, add the column from the bottom." She knew something was wrong, and she was giving him time to take his coat off and sit down before making it a conversation. He recognized this and was grateful for it. He sat down at the table and put the letter in front of her without speaking. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and opened it and read it. And he watched her face while she did. It didn't change dramatically. It did the careful thing, the controlled thing, but there was something underneath the control, a tightening around her eyes, a slight compression of her mouth, that told him the controlled thing was working harder than usual. She set the letter back on the table. "1 week, she said. "Yes." Lucy had stopped pretending to do arithmetic and was watching them both. Eleanor glanced at her, then back at Caleb. "I'll write to my sister tonight," Eleanor said. "If the roads are passable by the end of the week—" "Eleanor." She stopped. He had not figured out the full speech. He was not a man who gave speeches, and he knew that whatever came out of his mouth next would be imperfect and incomplete and not at all the calibrated, considered thing that the situation probably deserved. He said it anyway. "I'm not sending you away because 3 men on a committee have decided they know what's right for my family," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She looked at him. "But I need to think," he said. "Tonight. I need to—" He stopped. "Give me tonight." She looked at him for a long moment with those creek-water eyes, reading his face the way she always read his face, and whatever she found there seemed to settle something in her, because some of the tension in her expression eased fractionally. "All right," she said. She picked up the letter, folded it, and put it beside the workbook. Then she looked at Lucy's arithmetic and said, "You added wrong in the third column. Try again." He went to the barn after dinner. He went to the barn, and then he didn't stop at the barn. He saddled Ranger and rode out past the south pasture to the stand of cottonwoods along the creek, where the ground rose slightly and the trees were old enough to block the wind, and where, under the largest tree at the edge of the rise, Margaret Mercer was buried. He had not been here since October. He came irregularly, not on a schedule, not on her birthday or their anniversary, or any date that would have made the visits feel like observances. He came when he needed to, and he was aware that this sounded like something a person says when they're not ready to stop coming and can't admit it, but it was also simply true. He tied Ranger to a low branch and stood at the grave. The headstone was simple. He'd chosen it, carved by the stonemason in Billings. Her name, the dates, beloved wife and mother. The words had seemed both insufficient and accurate when he selected them, and they still seemed both things. He stood there in the cold, in the dark under the cottonwoods, with the creek making its quiet sound below, and the stars going in and out of cloud cover overhead, and he did not talk out loud, which was something he'd done in the first year, and had stopped doing because it had felt, eventually, like a way of keeping her close that was also keeping him stuck. But he thought about Margaret, not the grief version of her, not the absence, but the actual woman, the stubbornness, the opinions about books and most other things, the way she'd laughed at her own jokes before she got to the punchline, which had driven him insane, and which he would give a significant amount to hear again. The way she'd looked at him sometimes across the dinner table with an expression that said, "I know exactly what you're thinking, and I'm going to let you get there yourself." The way she'd loved Lucy, with a completeness and a joy that he had not quite been able to replicate on his own, and had spent 2 years feeling guilty about not replicating. He thought about Lucy on the fence rail. "What do you want?" He thought about the cabin at night, the fire burning, the smell of bread, the sound of his daughter laughing at a story about a goat on a roof. He thought about Eleanor's hands on Lucy's back during the fever. He thought about the blizzard and the firelight and 2 broken people in 2 chairs, finding the same fracture in each other and being, for once, not alone with it. He thought about what Margaret would say. He knew what Margaret would say. Margaret had never once in their 9 years together made a decision out of fear rather than honesty, and she had never had patience for him doing it either. She had pushed him toward things his caution told him to avoid: the expansion of the North Pasture, the risk of the cattle investment in '77, the decision to stay in Montana when the hard winter of '80 had made leaving look like the sensible option. She had been right every time, not because she was reckless, but because she understood the difference between caution and avoidance, and she had understood that he sometimes confused the two. He stood at her grave and understood, quite clearly and without particular drama, what she would say now. She would say, "Stop punishing yourself. Stop punishing the living for the sake of the dead. The dead don't need it, and the living can't afford it." She would say, "Your daughter needs a home, not a monument." She would probably also say something sharper and funnier than either of those things, something that would make him feel slightly defensive and then laugh and then concede the point. But those were the bones of it. He stood there for another few minutes. He looked at her name on the stone. "All right," he said out loud. Then he untied Ranger and rode back to the ranch in the dark. The next morning, he found Eleanor on the porch before breakfast. She had her packed bag at her feet. Not everything. Most of her belongings were still in the back room, but the bag she'd arrived with repacked, standing by the porch step as if ready for a stagecoach. She was standing with her back to the door, looking out at the ranch, and when he came through the door, she turned around, and he saw that she had made a decision of her own overnight and was carrying it in her posture, the straight-backed, composed, braced quality of someone who has resigned themselves to something hard. "The road to town is passable," she said. "I checked this morning." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. "I spoke to Lucy," Eleanor continued. "I explained that—" "What did Lucy say?" A pause. "She cried." He crossed the porch and picked up the bag and set it inside the door. Eleanor stared at him. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Caleb." "Not today." He looked at her directly. "I have something to do this morning. I need you to stay here with Lucy until I'm back. After that—" He stopped, then made himself continue. "After that, I'd like to talk to you about something, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold and gray, and the snow was hard and bright, and she stood on his porch in her coat and her composed expression with her bag inside the door, and she said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to town," he said. He saddled Ranger and rode into Millhaven at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was close enough that people saw him coming from a distance, which turned out to matter. The stagecoach station sat at the near end of Main Street, which meant it was the first thing anyone at the east end of town would see. Caleb arrived at the far end and rode the length of the street at the same purposeful pace, which had the effect, unplanned, but he noticed it, of drawing eyes from storefronts and windows as he passed. By the time he reached the station, there were a dozen people in various states of attention along the street, including Harlan Briggs outside the feed store, Ruth Calloway in front of the millinery, and Pastor Donaldson, who was coming out of the post office and stopped when he saw Caleb's face. Caleb dismounted and tied Ranger at the post. He turned around to find a small audience, which was not exactly what he'd intended, but which he decided in that moment was going to be useful. "Donaldson," he said at a volume calculated to carry. The pastor stopped in the street 12 feet away. Briggs had moved to the edge of the feed store porch. Ruth Calloway had stopped walking. A couple of men Caleb recognized from the ranching country south of town had paused their conversation to watch. "I got your letter," Caleb said. Donaldson glanced at the assembled onlookers with a brief involuntary unease. "Caleb, perhaps this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," Caleb said. "You brought this to the committee, which means you brought it to the town, so the town can hear the response." A silence. The main street of Millhaven was not a large venue, but sound traveled on cold air, and the people who'd stopped had not resumed moving. Caleb was not a man who enjoyed speaking in public. He was not performing. That was the honest truth of it, the thing he'd understood riding here. This was not a performance. This was simply a man saying a true thing out loud in front of witnesses, because some true things needed witnesses. "Eleanor Vale came to my door with a broken wagon and no shelter and the pass closed," he said. "I gave her a room. That is all that happened." He looked at Donaldson, then at Briggs, then let his gaze move across the faces in the street. "While she has been at my ranch, she has rebuilt the home that I let fall apart after my wife died. She has taught my daughter to bake bread and to read better and to laugh, which she had mostly stopped doing. She has nursed my daughter through a fever that had no doctor and no road to reach one, and she stayed awake for 3 nights to do it. My daughter is alive and healthy, and I believe that is due in no small part to Eleanor Vale." He paused. Briggs had the expression of a man who expected an argument and is recalibrating. Ruth Calloway's face had done something complicated. "Your committee's letter says she is a threat to my daughter's welfare," Caleb continued. "I am asking you, in front of your community, to explain that to me, because I have been watching this woman with my child every day for 2 months, and what I have seen is the opposite of a threat." Donaldson opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Caleb said. Donaldson closed his mouth. "I understand what the town thinks it's protecting," Caleb said. "I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that. This is a small community and people have standards they want to maintain, and I respect that most of the time." He looked at Donaldson. "But standards that require me to send a woman back into a Montana winter, a woman who saved my child, to satisfy the comfort of people who have never once knocked on my door in 2 years of watching me and my daughter grieve ourselves into the ground." He stopped. "Those are not standards I'm prepared to honor." The street was very quiet. "If the committee wants to file their petition," Caleb said, "I will see them in front of the county administrator. I will bring my daughter. I will let her speak for herself because she has things to say and she is not afraid to say them." He looked at Briggs. "And if anyone has anything further to add about Eleanor Vale's character, they can say it to me directly, right now or any time they like." Briggs looked at his boots. Donaldson looked at the street. Nobody said anything. Caleb untied Ranger. He was mounted and turning when he heard Ruth Calloway's voice behind him. "Caleb." He looked back. Ruth was standing in the street and her face had undergone some kind of internal negotiation that had arrived, visibly, at a different place than where it had started. "The fever?" she said. "You're Lucy? She's recovered?" "Fully," he said. Ruth looked at the ground briefly, then back up. Dora Whitmore's youngest had a hard winter 2 years back. High fever, same as that. She paused. I know what it is to sit up those nights. Another pause, longer. I'm glad Lucy's well. It was not an apology. It was not a reversal. It was a woman offering the one thing she could find to offer, which was an acknowledgement of something real, and he took it for what it was. Thank you, Ruth, he said. He rode back to the ranch. He did not feel triumphant. He had not gone to town for triumph. He had gone because some things needed to be said in front of witnesses, and he was the only person in a position to say them. And now they were said, and what the town did with them was the town's business. What his business was, what was waiting at the ranch when he rode up the track and tied Ranger at the post, was Eleanor on the porch and Lucy beside her, both of them watching him come. He dismounted. He came up the porch steps. Lucy was looking at him with wide eyes, and he realized she had clearly observed something in his face when he left that had told her more than he'd intended. Did you do something? Lucy asked. I said some things in town, he said. What things? Things that needed saying. Lucy looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He looked back at her, at the travel bag that was still inside the door where he'd put it, at Eleanor's face with its careful stillness that was working hard right now, at the way she was standing with her arms slightly crossed and her weight balanced, like a person braced against a wind that might come from any direction. Come inside, he said. It's cold. They went inside. The cabin was warm, the fire going, the smell of bread. There was always bread now. He'd stopped noticing and then started noticing again, hanging in the air. Lucy installed herself at the kitchen table with her schoolbook in a way that was transparently an attempt to be in the room without appearing to be present in the room. Caleb stood at the kitchen table. Eleanor stood across it. I meant what I said last night, he said, about not knowing how to do this. I want to be honest about that. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I have not been a whole person for 2 years. I am not certain I'm a whole person now. I have a ranch to run and a daughter to raise, and I am significantly better at the first thing than the second thing, and I know it. He stopped. What I also know is that whatever I have been managing to do right for Lucy since you came here, it's different from what I was doing before you came. And I would like... He stopped again. From the kitchen table with enormous and completely unconvincing subtlety, Lucy had stopped turning pages. I would like you to stay, he said. Not because the committee told you to leave, not because I need help on the ranch, because... He exhaled. Because the ranch feels like a home again, and I didn't know it had stopped until it started again. And because I think you know what I mean by that. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table. Her arms came uncrossed slowly, a small thing, barely visible. I know what you mean, she said. Then stay. The kitchen was quiet. The fire popped. Lucy was so still she appeared to have temporarily stopped breathing. Eleanor looked at the table, then at him. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be clear about that. I have opinions, and I will say them. I have grief that is not finished. I am... She stopped. I am not the person I was before Oregon, and I don't know exactly who I am now. I'm still finding out. I know, he said, and I won't be treated as a problem to be managed. I know that too. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, shed its last piece of armor, and underneath was something that was both softer and more real than what had been there before. All right, she said. From the kitchen table, an 8-year-old failed entirely to suppress a sound. Caleb looked at his daughter. Lucy looked back at him with the expression of a person who has been caught doing something and has decided that the best strategy is to look completely unapologetic about it. Were you listening? He asked. I live here, Lucy said. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved first and then his, and it wasn't laughter exactly. It was something quieter than that, something private and warm and tentative, the beginning of something neither of them was prepared to name out loud yet. But it was there, in the cabin that had been cold and was no longer cold, in the kitchen that smelled of bread, with a fire going and a child watching them both with a face full of open, uncomplicated hope. It was there. The committee never filed the petition. Caleb didn't find out officially. There was no letter, no formal notification, no visit from Eckerd with good news delivered from the saddle. He found out the way most things in a small town resolved themselves, which is gradually and without announcement. Donaldson stopped appearing at the ranch. Briggs went back to making comments about feed prices rather than morality. Ruth Calloway, the following Sunday, brought a jar of preserves to the ranch with no explanation attached, set it on the porch railing while Caleb was in the barn, and left without knocking. He found it when he came back inside, the label in her handwriting, Plum Autumn 83, and he put it in the kitchen without remarking on it, and Eleanor saw it and didn't ask where it came from, and that was the end of that. Small towns don't reverse themselves dramatically. They shift, quietly and incrementally, the way rivers shift course, not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of small adjustments, until one day you look and the water is going a different way. What Caleb had said on Main Street did not change minds so much as it gave people permission to let their minds rest. People had been performing an opinion. He had made the performance too costly to continue. What actually changed things more than his speech was time and Lucy. His daughter went back to school the week after the fever broke, and she went back as a child who had recovered from something serious and knew it, which gave her a particular authority. When Sarah Briggs made another comment, smaller this time, a mumbled thing in the schoolyard rather than a public pronouncement, Lucy looked at her with the flat, measuring expression that was purely Mercer and said, "Eleanor saved my life. Did your mama ever do that for anyone?" Sarah Briggs had no answer for this. The teacher, Miss Avery, heard about it secondhand and said nothing official, but the following week she brought the class a book about frontier medicine and women healers, which was both a lesson and a statement, and nobody missed the point. Caleb heard all of this from Lucy at dinner, delivered as straightforward report rather than drama, and he looked at his daughter across the table. This 8-year-old child who had learned something in the last 2 months that some people never learn, which is that the right thing and the easy thing are different things and both have costs, and felt something in his chest that was too large for the size of a kitchen table but belonged there anyway. Eleanor listened to Lucy's account and said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know," Lucy said. "I wanted to." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said, quietly and directly, the way she said everything. Lucy shrugged with the casual dignity of a child who has done something good and doesn't need applause for it. Then she asked for more bread. March came slowly, the way March comes in Montana. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation. Warm days followed by hard freezes. The snow retreating from the south-facing slopes and returning overnight. The creek rising and dropping and rising again as the temperature couldn't make up its mind. Caleb watched the season turning with the particular attention of a rancher who knows that the work of spring is coming and that the work of spring does not wait for a man to be ready. But the ranch was different this spring, not unrecognizably so. The same fence lines, the same barn, the same mud season that turned the track to the road into something that tested the patience of horses and men equally. But different in the way that mattered, which was that the work was shared now, in the ordinary and unromantic way that real shared life works. Eleanor took on the kitchen garden with a seriousness that Caleb would have found slightly aggressive if he hadn't quickly realized she knew exactly what she was doing. She turned the soil herself in early March, working in sections over several days, and planted things in an order that suggested she'd thought about the whole season at once rather than just the immediate moment. She had opinions about where the rows should run relative to the sun that turned out, when he checked them against his own understanding of the property, to be completely correct. He told her this. She said, "I know." He almost said something else, caught it, said instead, "The pole beans will do better on the east side. I already moved them." He looked. She had. He went back to the barn. This was not a smooth or effortless domestic arrangement. He would not let it be remembered that way. They argued about the pole beans 2 days later when she decided to move them again based on new information about the drainage, and he felt that 2 relocations was 1 relocation too many and said so, with more heat than the pole beans actually warranted. She told him the drainage mattered more than his opinion about optimal relocation frequency, which was delivered with a precision that indicated she had prepared this sentence in advance. He said something about whose garden it technically was. She gave him the look. The one that suggested he was being exactly as stubborn as she'd been warned he was, and went back to planting. The pole beans did better on the east side. This was never discussed again. There were harder things than pole beans. Eleanor had nights. He'd known this for months, heard her through the wall sometimes, the quiet restlessness of someone whose sleep was interrupted by things that didn't behave the same way in the dark as they did in daylight. He didn't ask about them directly because he had nights of his own and knew they weren't helped by being questioned, but he noticed when she was tired in the specific way, the careful, slightly slowed quality of someone running on less than they needed. And on those mornings, he made the coffee stronger and didn't start any conversations that required full cognitive function. She noticed this, eventually. "You make better coffee when I've slept badly," she said one morning in April, with the suspicious tone of a person who has just detected a pattern. "Coffee's always the same," he said. She looked at him across the table. "It isn't," she said. He drank his coffee. "Caleb, the stock needs rotating today," he said. "North pasture." She let it go. But he saw the corner of her mouth, and he turned back to his coffee before she could see his. The thing about grief, and this is something neither of them could have articulated cleanly, but both of them were living, is that it doesn't end. This is the lie that the story of recovery tells, the neat version, the one where healing is a destination rather than a condition. What actually happens, for people who've lost the way they had, is that grief becomes something you carry differently over time. Not lighter, exactly. More balanced, maybe. More incorporated into the normal weight of being alive rather than an additional weight on top of it. Caleb still went to the cottonwoods sometimes. Not often. Not with the desperate frequency of the first year, when he'd gone almost weekly, searching for something in the cold and the silence that he couldn't quite find and couldn't stop looking for. Now he went occasionally, in the early evening, and stood for a while, and thought about Margaret without the thoughts turning into something that hollowed him out. He went once in April, on a Thursday evening when the light was long and golden and the cottonwoods were starting to show their first pale green. He stood at the grave and looked at the headstone and said, out loud, what he'd been thinking about for several weeks. "I'm going to ask her," he said. The creek made its noise below. The light moved through the young leaves. "I don't know if I'm doing it right," he said. "I don't know if there's a right way, but I know she's good, and I know she's real, and I know what this place feels like with her in it." He paused. "I know you'd have opinions about the timing and possibly about the method. You'd probably tell me I'm being characteristically slow about it." He looked at the headstone for a moment. "You'd also probably tell me to stop talking to a gravestone about my personal life and go do the thing." He stood there a moment longer. "Lucy's good," he said. "She's really good." He rode back to the ranch. He asked Eleanor on a Saturday evening in late April, and he did it badly, which was appropriate. He had intended to do it after dinner, with some form of deliberate setting, which already would have been unlike him, but he thought the occasion warranted the effort. What actually happened was that he came in from the barn to find Eleanor on the porch in the last light, sitting on the top step with her knees drawn up and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching the sun drop behind the range, and she looked entirely like herself. No management, no armor, just a woman watching the mountains with her hair coming loose from the knot at the back of her neck, and the intended after-dinner setting collapsed entirely. He sat down beside her on the step. She looked at him, read his face, and looked back at the mountains. She had learned over these months when something was coming. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know." "How do you know?" "You've been circling something for 3 weeks," she said. "You circle things before you do them. It's a habit." He thought about pointing out that this was a fairly personal observation, and then thought better of it. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, I want to marry you." He said it flatly, in the direct way he said things that had weight, and it landed in the April air between them and sat there. She looked at the mountains for a moment that felt long. "That's not a question," she said. "I know." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She turned and looked at him. The sun was almost gone behind the range, and the sky above it was doing something with orange and deep blue that would have been worth remarking on under different circumstances. "You know what you're getting," she said. It was not a deflection. She was being serious the way she was always serious when something mattered. "I am not easy. I carry things. I will have opinions about your fence lines and your pole beans and the way you store the winter supplies, and I will be right about some of them and wrong about some of them, and I will not always immediately concede the ones I'm wrong about." I know, he said. And I'm not Margaret, she said, quietly but directly. I know that. I know you're not Margaret, he said. I'm not asking you to be Margaret. I'm asking you to be here. She looked at him. I know this isn't Oregon, he said. I know it's not what you had. It's a harder country and a harder life, and the winters are— I know what the winters are, she said. I've been through one. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The last light was going, and the mountains were turning from orange to gray, and the first stars were starting in the east, and the ranch was quiet around them. The horses settling, the creek running, the ordinary sounds of a place that had, at some point in the last 5 months, started feeling like more than where they were living. Lucy, Eleanor said. She knows, he said. She'll probably be insufferable about it. The corner of Eleanor's mouth moved. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, you'll marry me, or yes, she'll be insufferable. Both, Eleanor said. The thing about a moment like that, the thing that the soft version of the story doesn't tell you, is that it is not clean and cinematic. It is two imperfect people sitting on cold porch steps in fading light, with all their damage and their history between them, saying yes to something they can't fully see yet, and doing it anyway. There's nothing tidy about it. There is no part of it that doesn't involve some courage. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and she didn't pull away. They sat there while the light finished going and the stars came fully out and the ranch settled into its night sounds. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things don't need more words after the important word has been said. From inside the cabin, the sound of the back door opening and Lucy's voice saying, "Are you both just going to sit out there all night? It is cold, and also I want to know what happened," floated out into the dark. And Eleanor laughed. The real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that had become one of the sounds Caleb associated now with the ranch in the way he associated the creek and the horses and the morning birds. "We should go inside," Eleanor said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Eleanor. For what it's worth. He was looking at the dark mountains. I know this is not the life you planned. I know it's not. I know it comes with loss already in it. Both of us. He paused. But I want you to know that whatever you had before, whatever you lost, it's not less because you're here. It doesn't have to be. He stopped, aware that he was getting into territory where his vocabulary was inadequate. You don't have to stop being who you were to be who you are now. I don't need that from you. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have liked Lucy, she said. It was the first time she had said her son's name in a sentence that was present tense rather than past tense, and he heard the difference. He was bossy in the same way, thought he knew better than everyone. A pause. He was usually right. Sounds exhausting. It was, she said. It was wonderful. He held her hand and she let him, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars. And eventually Lucy appeared in the doorway again with her coat on and her arms crossed in an impression of her father that was accurate enough to be slightly alarming, and they went inside. Spring came the rest of the way in May. The snow retreated from the high country, and the creek ran high and cold, and the meadows below the north pasture went green so fast it seemed almost aggressive. The ranch work expanded the way it always did. More hours, more demands, the accumulated repairs of winter making their claims. Caleb worked longer days and came in tired and ate well and slept better than he had in 3 years, which was not a coincidence, and he knew it. Eleanor's garden came in with the confidence of something planted by a person who knew what they were doing. The kitchen had herbs hanging from the ceiling beam by June. Lucy learned to identify each one by smell, a game Eleanor had invented that became a daily ritual. Lucy blindfolded, hands behind her back, listing the herbs in the order she encountered them, Eleanor moving the bundles around to prevent memorization, both of them taking it completely seriously. He watched this from the doorway sometimes. He watched it without analyzing it, without cataloging it, without doing the thing he'd done in the early weeks of bracing against what he was feeling. He just watched it and let it be what it was, which was his daughter and the woman he was going to marry, standing in his kitchen, arguing about whether dried rosemary smelled different from fresh rosemary, which apparently was a real debate with strong positions on both sides. The Millhaven Community Welfare Committee met twice more that spring on unrelated matters. Donaldson nodded at Caleb outside the post office in April. A brief, neutral nod, the kind that means we have moved past that thing without either party being required to acknowledge what the thing was. Caleb nodded back. That was sufficient. Ruth Calloway brought a second jar of preserves in May. Strawberry this time. She knocked, which was different from the first jar. Eleanor answered the door, and Caleb watched from the kitchen table as the two women stood on the porch and talked for 10 minutes. Not warmly, exactly, not yet, but without the performance of disapproval that had characterized their earlier non-interactions. Ruth left with a small packet of Eleanor's dried chamomile, which Eleanor had offered for Ruth's daughter-in-law, who apparently had trouble sleeping. Small things. Incremental shifts. The river going a different way. He proposed properly, with a ring, 2 weeks after the porch steps. He'd ridden to Billings for it, which was a full day each way, and he'd stood in the jeweler's for longer than he'd expected because it turned out he had opinions about rings that he hadn't known he had. He brought back a simple gold band with a small garnet. Not showy, nothing that would embarrass her or seem like something being performed for an audience. He gave it to her in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, with Lucy present because Lucy had been present for everything important in this house, and it seemed wrong to exclude her now. Eleanor looked at it in his palm for a moment, then put it on, and it fit, which he'd had to guess at and had worried about. And she looked at it on her hand with an expression that was complicated and real and not entirely happy and not entirely sad, but somewhere in the specific human territory that exists between those things when the present is good and the past is still the past. It fits, he said. It does, she said. I measured your other ring when you were asleep. She looked up. That's slightly alarming. I needed the size. Lucy, from the kitchen stool, said, He practiced saying the question 4 times in the barn. I heard him. Lucy, Caleb said. I'm just saying she should know what she's getting, Lucy said. Eleanor looked at the ring, then at Lucy, then at Caleb with an expression that contained, somewhere in it, the specific warmth of a person who has found the place where they belong and is not yet entirely used to having found it, still slightly surprised by it, still slightly careful with it, the way you're careful with things you've wanted for a long time and have learned not to assume will stay. I know what I'm getting, Eleanor said. The wedding was small and held at the ranch in June, with the mountains bright against a blue sky and the meadow below the north pasture green enough to seem almost unreal after the long winter. They kept it to the few people who'd earned the right to be there, Pete Granger and his wife, Eckert and his family, Miss Avery from the school, old Sam Whitfield, who'd been the closest thing to a doctor in Mill Haven for 20 years and who had ridden out during Lucy's fever, too late to help but present to try. Ruth Calloway came, which surprised Caleb somewhat, and she brought her daughter-in-law, who had apparently been sleeping better. The ceremony was short. They both said what they meant without saying too much. Caleb held Eleanor's hands at the front of the assembled people in the yard of his own ranch and looked at her face and said, I will be here. She said, I will be here. That was the essential part. Lucy stood beside Eleanor in a dress she'd chosen herself and wore with the solemnity of a person taking an important role seriously, and she held the ring when asked to hold it and handed it over without dropping it, which she had been practicing. And when it was done, she took Eleanor's hand without being asked and held it, and Eleanor held it back. This is the thing about broken people finding each other. It is not a repair. That's the wrong word for it, the wrong image. Nothing is restored to its original condition. Margaret is still in the ground under the cottonwoods. Thomas is still gone from an Oregon trail that nobody passes anymore. The losses are still losses, fully and without revision. What happens instead is something different from repair. It is more like what happens when 2 trees grow near each other for long enough. They don't become one tree, they remain themselves, but they grow in shapes that account for each other, that make room for each other, that are changed by the proximity in ways that neither could have predicted from the beginning. Caleb Mercer was not a different man in June than he had been in November. He was still slow to talk and quick to work and more comfortable with horses than with people and prone to managing his feelings through manual labor. He was still the man who drove fence posts when he should be having conversations. He still woke in the dark sometimes and lay in the too large bed and felt the weight of what he'd lost. Because that weight doesn't lift. It only becomes something you're stronger for having carried. But he got up in the mornings now without the particular dread of a man who is not sure what the day is for. He ate dinner at a table where people talked. He laughed. Not often, he was not a frequent laugher and never would be, but genuinely, the real kind, the kind that catches you off guard. He visited Margaret's grave in the fall, when the cottonwoods turned gold. He stood there in the same way he always had, with the creek below and the sky above, and her name in stone in front of him, and he said what he'd come to say. "She's good," he said. "Eleanor's good. Harder than you in some ways, quieter, different kind of stubborn." He looked at the stone for a moment. "Lucy's good. She's so good. He stopped. "You'd find her hilarious. She's been insufferable about being right about things, and I have no idea where she gets it." He stood there a while longer. "I'm not forgetting you," he said. "I want you to know that. It isn't replacing. There's no word for what it is." He paused. "I just wanted to come and tell you that we're all right, that we're more than all right." Another pause. "I think that's what you'd want to know." He rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the mountains going gold around him, and the air clean and cold with the first edge of coming winter. The cabin was lit from inside when he came up the track. Warm yellow light in the windows, smoke from the chimney, the smell of dinner reaching him before he'd finished tying Ranger at the post. He could hear Lucy through the door before he opened it, the end of some story she was telling at volume, and Eleanor's voice beneath it, lower, asking a question. He stood on the porch for a moment. The door was right there. The warmth was right there. Everything he had, everything that had come back to him, and everything new that had arrived in a stranger's shape on a frozen morning with snow on her coat and bread on his cutting board, it was all right there, on the other side of a door that was his to open. He opened it. "About time," Lucy said without looking up from the table. "Dinner's ready and I'm starving." Eleanor looked up from the stove and looked at him. Just looked at him, the way she looked at him now, without the careful management, just the honest face, reading his face in return. "Good ride?" she said. "Good ride," he said. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table where 3 plates were set, where they were always set now, where his daughter was already reaching for the bread and talking about something that had happened at school, her voice filling the room the way it filled rooms now, easily and without effort, the sound of a child who has been allowed to take up space again. Outside, the Montana evening was doing what Montana evenings do in fall, cold and clear and enormous, the sky going dark blue at the edges and the first stars showing, the mountains standing their permanent watch over the valley below. Inside, the fire burned, the bread was warm, the table had 3 plates, and the ranch, which had been a place where a man was just surviving, had become, slowly, imperfectly, through hard seasons and harder choices, and 2 people stubborn enough to stay, something a great deal more than that. It had become, without anyone quite deciding that was what it would be, a home.